They say a wedding is supposed to be the happiest day of your life. The moment you stand before the world, pledging your love to the one person who sees you, understands you, and chooses you. I had waited for this day for years. Every detail, planned to perfection. The venue, the flowers, the music, even the precise moment I'd take Elena's hands in mine, promising her forever. Everything was flawless. Or so I thought. And then, my sister walked in. I didn't need to turn around. I knew that walk, knew that deliberate pace, knew the way the air changed when Rachel entered a room. Then, in one swift motion, she grabbed the microphone from the officiant's stand. And with the sweetest smile, she said, "Sorry, everyone. I just couldn't let this joke go on any longer." I could feel Elena freeze beside me, could hear the slight hitch in her breath, but she didn't move. Rachel continued, her voice dripping with false concern. "My poor, pathetic brother. You actually think this woman loves you?" The silence in the room felt like it could crush me. My entire world, the life I was building, was unraveling before my eyes. "Oh, come on. This is ridiculous. Elena, really? You're going to stand here and pretend like this is real? I mean, look at him." Rachel let out a laugh. A real laugh. "Daniel, you barely graduated. You're broke. You have nothing to offer anyone, let alone someone like her. And you actually thought she'd marry you?" I wanted to move, to say something, to stop her, but I felt nailed to the spot. Rachel wasn't just ruining my wedding. She was tearing apart my dignity in front of everyone I respected. "And you." She tilted her head. "What's your game here? Pity? A dare? A bet? Because there is no way, you're actually in love with this loser." Rachel smirked. "No words? Figures. If you were smart, you'd walk out right now." Then, without warning, Rachel grabs a full glass of red wine from the nearest table and hurls it straight at me. I heard the glass shatter. I felt the warmth of the liquid soak into my clothes. Rachel's voice sliced through the shock. "There. Now you look as ridiculous as this whole wedding." And then, Rachel lunges toward the wedding cake. A part of me snapped. Rachel thought she had one, that she had destroyed me, that I would crumble like that cake at her feet. But she had no idea. She had no idea who my wife really was. Rachel stood there, laughing like she had won some twisted game, reveling in the mess she had made. The wedding cake lay in ruins, red wine soaked through my white tuxedo, and the guests sat frozen in the thick, choking silence she had created. But Elena, she just stood there, calm, her hands still resting gently on the bouquet. She hadn't flinched when the wine flew, hadn't blinked when the cake hit the floor. Her gaze never left Rachel, but there was something about the way she was watching her, assessing her, dissecting her, that made my stomach tighten. Rachel didn't notice. She was too busy basking in her own destruction, but I noticed. And for the first time in my life, I felt something shift inside me. I had spent my entire existence being at the mercy of Rachel's cruelty. I knew that better than anyone. Rachel was always the golden child, the one who got away with everything. She could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. She was their pride, their perfect little masterpiece. And I was just the inconvenience that came after. I learned that lesson early. When we were kids, she would take my toys and break them. And if I ever tried to fight back, I was the one who got punished. My father would grip my shoulder too tightly and say, "Stop being dramatic, Daniel. She's just playing." When I got older, it got worse. In high school, she found out I had a crush on a girl in my class, Anna Wilcox. The next day, she made sure Anna got an anonymous note, supposedly from me, confessing to the most humiliating things. I walked into school the next morning, and laughter followed me down the hall. Rachel just smiled from across the cafeteria, giving me a small, knowing wave. I had tried to tell my parents what she did. My mother sighed and said, "Daniel, you always take things so personally. Maybe if you had a little more confidence, girls wouldn't laugh at you." And my father just went back to his newspaper. I never brought it up again, but I never forgot. By the time we were adults, Rachel had perfected the art of destroying me without ever getting her hands dirty. She took everything I ever wanted and crushed it beneath her heel. My first job interview at a prestigious law firm? She made sure to mention to the recruiter, who happened to be her colleague, that I had been struggling with responsibility my whole life, that I was prone to emotional outbursts. I didn't get the job. When I finally moved out and got my first apartment, she accidentally let my landlord know about my unstable work history, making them hesitant to lease to me. I had to pay double the security deposit just to keep the place. Every single time I clawed my way towards something good, Rachel was there, smiling, waiting, ready to tear it apart. It was a game to her, a game she always won. And then I met Elena. Rachel hated her from the moment they met. Not because Elena was rude or distant. On the contrary, she was polite, warm even, in that carefully measured way she always was. No, Rachel hated her because she couldn't figure her out. Elena didn't react to Rachel the way most people did. She didn't fawn over her charm. She didn't shrink under her scrutiny. She simply existed in Rachel's space like she had every right to be there. Like Rachel's approval meant nothing to her. And that drove Rachel insane. At first, she tried to do what she always did, whispering poison into my ear. "Daniel, are you sure she's not using you? A woman like that could do so much better than you. Doesn't that make you wonder why she's here?" But I didn't bite. Then she tried something else. She went after Elena directly, under the guise of sisterly concern, inviting her out for coffee and slipping in little barbs between sips of espresso. "Daniel's sweet, but he's not exactly the most reliable, is he? You seem like a woman who knows what she wants. I'm just surprised someone like you would settle for someone like him." Elena just smiled. She never defended me, never argued. She just watched Rachel, like a cat watching a mouse scurry around, unaware of the danger above. And that only made Rachel more determined. She started interfering more. Little things, trying to plant doubt, leaving hints that I was keeping secrets, spinning lies so subtly even I started questioning if I had said or done something wrong. And then, when none of that worked, she went after the wedding. She bribed the planner, sent fake emails to vendors, canceling orders, misplaced the guest list, making sure half our closest friends never got their invitations. She did everything in her power to make sure this day never happened. But here we were. I had ignored every warning sign, every red flag. I had convinced myself that this was just Rachel being Rachel, that she wouldn't go too far, that she wouldn't destroy the most important moment of my life. But she did. She had finally done it. As I stood there in my ruined tuxedo, watching my wedding collapse around me, I realized something. Rachel had spent her entire life winning. She had spent her entire life tearing me down. She had spent her entire life treating me like the weak, useless little brother who would never fight back. And I had let her, because I had never had the power to stop her. But Rachel made a mistake. Because this time, she didn't just attack me. She attacked my wife. And she had no idea who my wife really was. I exhaled slowly, the weight of years pressing against my chest. And then I turned to Elena. She was still calm, still composed, but her fingers had loosened around the bouquet. And when she finally moved, setting it gently on the table beside her, I saw it. The first real emotion she had shown all night. Not anger, not shock, not sadness. No, she was smiling. But there was no warmth in it. It was cold, calculated, like she had been waiting for this moment, like she had been waiting for Rachel to cross that line. And in that moment, I knew Rachel's game was over. She just didn't know it yet. Before we continue, we've noticed that 80% of our viewers watch our content without subscribing. If you enjoy deep, gripping stories like this, please support us by hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications so you never miss an update. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Rachel was still standing there, basking in the wreckage of my wedding, her smile widening with every second of silence. She thought she had one. She thought she had shattered something that couldn't be repaired. She had no idea that she had just walked into something far bigger than she could comprehend. I turned to Elena, and for the first time since Rachel stormed in, I saw it, the shift. It was slight, barely noticeable, but it was there. The way she tilted her head just slightly, the way her fingers brushed against her wrist as if adjusting something unseen. I had spent years trying to protect myself from Rachel. I had built walls, tried to ignore her, tried to believe that if I just kept my head down, she would stop. Elena? She had never been the kind of person to build walls. She built traps. Rachel, oblivious, turned to the guests, her arms spreading as if this was some grand performance. Come on, people, don't just sit there. You were all thinking it, weren't you? She let out a sharp laugh. This was never going to last. My brother barely has his life together. And she, Rachel gestured toward Elena as if she were some passing stranger. She is so out of his league it's laughable. Elena didn't react. She just picked up a napkin and started dabbing at the corner of my tuxedo, as if Rachel's voice was nothing more than background noise. That silence, that eerie calm, it was what finally made Rachel falter. Her laughter died down just a bit. You're really going to stand there and pretend like none of this matters, she said, her voice sharper now. Elena finally looked up. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes locked onto Rachel's, and for the first time in her life, my sister hesitated. Do you really want to know why I haven't said anything, Rachel? Elena asked, voice light, almost amused. Rachel scoffed. Oh, please, spare me the theatrics. Elena's lips twitched. Not quite a smile. Not quite a smirk. I was waiting. Rachel blinked. For what? Elena set the napkin down. Her fingers tapped lightly against the table's surface, slow and deliberate. For you to finish digging your own grave. The room went completely still. Rachel's confidence wavered for the first time. It wasn't much, just a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but it was enough. Elena knew exactly how to get under her skin. She was patient. Where Rachel used chaos as a weapon, Elena wielded silence like a blade. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to throw insults. She just let Rachel drown in the weight of her own actions. And Rachel? Rachel hated losing control. You're both insane, she muttered, running a hand through her hair. I don't have time for this. She turned, already moving toward the exit, but she barely made it 2 steps before a voice stopped her cold. Rachel. It was Elena again. Rachel paused but didn't turn around. You're not leaving yet, Elena continued. Not until you see exactly what happens when you cross the wrong people. The air shifted. Rachel turned back, eyes narrowing. Excuse me? Elena didn't answer right away. She simply reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen a few times. And then the room filled with sound. A recording. Rachel's voice, crystal clear. I don't care what you have to do, just make sure the venue cancels at the last minute. And while you're at it, maybe misplace a few key decorations. Hell, if you can make sure the florist backs out too, even better. I want this wedding to be a disaster. Rachel's face drained of color. The guests, previously silent, began to murmur. A few heads turned, eyes widening in disbelief. Rachel lunged forward. Where the hell did you get that? Elena tilted her head, still eerily calm. You're sloppy. You always have been. She slipped the phone back into her pocket. And you talk too much. Rachel's breath came fast now, her fingers curling into fists. This is fake. You edited this. Did I? Elena asked, raising an eyebrow. Should we call the wedding planner? Or maybe the florist? I'm sure they'd love to confirm exactly how many emails they mysteriously received from an anonymous source just days before the wedding. Rachel took a step back, then another. But she wasn't done yet. She never knew when to quit. Her gaze darted around the room, searching for support, for anyone who would take her side. She found none. Her expression twisted. Oh, I see what this is. You think you can just, what? Humiliate me in front of everyone? Make me look like the villain? Elena sighed, shaking her head. Rachel, you don't need any help looking like the villain. You did that all by yourself. Rachel's eyes burned with fury. She wasn't used to being the one backed into a corner. She wasn't used to losing. And so she did what she always did. She lashed out. You really think you're better than me, don't you? She spat. You're just a glorified gold digger. You latched onto my idiot brother because he's easy to control, and you knew he'd never question you. That's why you're here. That's why you're so calm. Because you already won, didn't you? Elena tilted her head, considering her. You talk too much, Rachel. Rachel let out a humorless laugh. Oh, I'm sorry. Am I ruining the perfect little game you're playing? Is that why you've got your claws in Daniel? Because he's weak enough to let you? Elena's expression didn't change, but I knew my wife, and I knew what that look meant. Rachel had just crossed the last line. Elena finally stepped forward, closing the distance between them until they were only inches apart. Rachel's breath hitched, but she held her ground. "You're not as smart as you think you are," Elena murmured. "And you just made a mistake you can't undo." Rachel tried to scoff, to roll her eyes, to dismiss the words the way she always did. But for the first time, she couldn't, because something in Elena's voice told her that whatever was coming next, whatever she had just set in motion, was something she would not walk away from unscathed. And that was when the fear finally crept into Rachel's eyes. She had spent her whole life ruining others. Now it was her turn. She just didn't know how far the fall would be. Rachel was still standing there, her breath uneven, her body stiff as if willing itself not to betray the panic creeping through her. She had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the rules of every game she played. But she wasn't playing anymore. This was something else, something she didn't understand. Elena took a step back, her movements as slow and precise as ever. Her fingers adjusting the cuff of her sleeve like this was just another ordinary evening. But there was nothing ordinary about what was happening now. Rachel swallowed, glancing around as if someone, anyone, would step in and shift the balance of power back in her favor. But the guests weren't on her side this time. No sympathetic glances. No awkward laughter to soften her impact. She was standing alone. For the first time in her life, she was actually alone. Elena exhaled lightly, tilting her head. "Are you ready?" Rachel blinked. "For what?" Elena smiled, but there was no kindness in it. "For the consequences." The words sent an undeniable chill through the room. Rachel, always quick to recover, forced a scoff. "You're so full of yourself. You think you scare me? You think you can ruin my life?" Elena's gaze didn't waver. "Oh, Rachel," she said, voice softer now, almost pitying. "I don't have to ruin your life." She turned slightly, looking over at me. "You already did that yourself." Rachel's jaw clenched, her hands tightening at her sides. "This is ridiculous. I don't have time for whatever this is." She turned sharply, striding toward the exit, determined to leave on her own terms. She didn't make it that far. The moment she reached the doorway, two men stepped inside, blocking her path. They weren't security. They weren't part of the wedding staff. They were something else entirely. Rachel stopped so suddenly she almost stumbled. She took a half step back, her eyes flickering with confusion as she tried to process what was happening. "Move," she demanded, but her voice had lost its edge. The men didn't respond. They just stood there, silent, unmoving, waiting. Rachel turned to me, her hands lifting slightly. "Daniel, what is this?" I didn't answer. Elena did. "You've spent your whole life playing games, Rachel," she said, still perfectly composed. "But there's something you never understood about power." Rachel shook her head, her forced bravado cracking. "You're insane." Elena ignored her. "Power isn't about controlling people. It's about knowing what they fear most." Rachel let out a shaky breath. "I don't. You fear being insignificant," Elena continued, her voice deceptively gentle. "You fear being irrelevant. That's why you've spent your entire life tearing others down. Because as long as someone else is suffering, you don't have to feel small." Rachel's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. "But you made a mistake," Elena murmured. "You let me into your world. And you should have been smarter than that." Rachel swallowed. And then Elena turned slightly and nodded. The two men at the door stepped forward. Rachel took a sharp step back. "No. Wait, what are you doing?" No response. She turned wildly to me now, her voice rising. "Daniel, what the hell is going on?" I didn't answer. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't have to. Elena had always known what kind of person Rachel was, and she had prepared for this moment long before the wedding. The men flanked her now, their presence suffocating. Rachel's chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths. "You can't just—" "You had a choice," Elena interrupted, her tone light, conversational. "You could have stayed out of our lives. You could have walked away. She sighed, shaking her head. But you never knew when to stop. Rachel licked her lips, her mind racing. I didn't do anything illegal. Elena raised an eyebrow. Didn't you? Rachel froze. And that was when she realized. This wasn't about just the wedding. Elena had dug into her past. Rachel had spent years manipulating people, making moves she thought were untraceable. The bribes, the lies, the blackmail. She had always been careful, but not careful enough. You're bluffing, Rachel whispered. Elena didn't respond. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. With a few taps, a recording played through the speakers. Not the wedding sabotage. Something else. I told you. Just wire the money and make sure no one traces it back to me. I don't care what happens to him. Just get it done. If he has to lose his job, so be it. If it ruins his reputation, even better. Rachel's face drained of color. I knew that voice. I knew that moment. It was from years ago, when I had lost my job, when my career had mysteriously unraveled overnight. I had always suspected Rachel had a hand in it, but I could never prove it. Until now. Rachel shook her head, stumbling back. No, that's... Elena clicked a button, and another recording played. Make sure the accident looks like an accident. I don't need questions. Just results. Rachel whimpered. Elena tilted her head. I wonder what the police will think about that one. Rachel spun toward me, her breath frantic. Daniel, listen to me. She reached out, but I took a step back. I had nothing left to say to her. She turned to Elena instead, her face contorted in desperation. Please, you don't have to do this. Elena exhaled softly, like she had already made peace with everything that was happening. I don't, she admitted. Then she smiled. But I want to. Rachel barely had time to react before the men grabbed her. She let out a strangled scream, thrashing, but they were stronger. The guests gasped, some of them rising from their seats, but no one moved to help her. No one wanted to help her. Because the truth was, Rachel had made too many enemies. And now, she had run out of places to hide. She screamed my name as they dragged her away, begged, cursed, pleaded, and for the first time in my life, I felt nothing. No guilt, no remorse. Just the weight of a lifetime of cruelty finally settling into its rightful place. By the time Rachel disappeared through the doors, the wedding hall was silent again. Elena turned back to me, brushing invisible dust from her sleeve. Now, she said lightly, where were we? And just like that, the wedding continued. Rachel was gone. And for the first time in my life, I was free. The wedding resumed. The guests, still shaken, sat in stunned silence as the officiant cleared his throat, unsure if he should continue. The remnants of Rachel's destruction still lingered. Smashed cake on the floor, wine staining my tuxedo, whispers buzzing like static in the air. But none of it mattered. Rachel was gone. Elena looked at me, her expression unreadable. There was no smugness, no gloating, just quiet certainty, as if this had all been inevitable from the start. I exhaled slowly, feeling something foreign settle in my chest. Relief. The weight that had been pressing down on me for years had finally lifted. I had spent a lifetime being hunted by Rachel's cruelty, and now, for the first time, she was the one who had to run. The officiant hesitated, then looked between us. Would you like to continue? I turned to Elena. She hadn't moved. Her fingers rested lightly against the fabric of her dress, her posture still composed. But there was something in the way she held herself now, something looser, something lighter. She met my gaze, and for the first time since the chaos erupted, she smiled. Yes, I said. Let's continue. The ceremony proceeded. The vows were spoken. Rings exchanged. A kiss sealed the moment, and applause finally broke through the tension in the room. But I knew the story wasn't over. Rachel wasn't the kind of person to disappear quietly. And as much as I wanted to believe this was the end, there was still one lingering thought in the back of my mind. Where had they taken her? And what would happen next? The answer came sooner than I expected. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing violently on the nightstand. Elena stirred beside me but didn't open her eyes. I reached for the phone, blinking against the morning light. The caller ID flashed a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated for only a moment before answering. A voice, smooth and detached, greeted me. "Your sister is gone." A pause. I sat up, my pulse steady but cold. "What do you mean?" "She ran," the voice replied. "Or at least she tried." A slow exhale. I ran a hand through my hair, already knowing the answer but needing to ask anyway. "Did she make it?" A beat of silence. Then, "No." I closed my eyes. Not relief, not sorrow, just an ending. The voice continued. It was quick. "We made sure of it." I nodded to myself, swallowing down the last traces of hesitation. "I understand." A quiet chuckle. "I knew you would." The call ended. I set the phone down and leaned back against the pillows. Elena finally opened her eyes, watching me carefully. "It's done?" she asked. I nodded. She studied me for a moment, then simply said, "Good." That was it. No long discussion. No drawn-out reflections. Because we both understood. Rachel had spent her entire life tormenting others, pushing limits, playing games she thought she could never lose. But the thing about playing with fire is that eventually, you get burned. And in the end, she had no one to blame but herself. The fallout came in waves. First, the news of Rachel's sudden disappearance spread. Some of our relatives expressed concern, but most didn't press too hard. She had always been reckless, always causing problems. So when she vanished, most people simply assumed she had run from some trouble of her own making. And we let them believe that. My parents, though, were different. The moment they realized Rachel was gone, they turned to me, desperate, accusing. "You have to help find her," my mother pleaded, clutching my hands. "She's your sister, Daniel." My father's silence was heavier. His eyes, sharp and assessing, bore into me like he suspected something but didn't want to voice it. I met his gaze without flinching. "Rachel is gone," I said simply, "and maybe that's for the best." My mother recoiled, horror creeping into her expression. "How can you say that?" I let out a slow breath. "Because I'm done pretending she was ever anything but toxic. I'm done acting like she didn't destroy everything she touched." Her lips trembled. "She was family." "No," I said quietly. "She was a parasite." A sharp intake of breath. And then the silence stretched between us, the final, irreversible fracture in whatever bond we still had. They left that night. They didn't say goodbye. And I didn't reach out. Weeks passed. The wedding, despite its chaos, had set a new course for my life. Without Rachel's shadow looming over me, I saw the world differently. Elena and I moved forward, stronger than before. I no longer felt the constant need to look over my shoulder, waiting for the next disaster. Because this time, the storm had passed, and there was no one left to bring it back. One evening, as we sat on our balcony, Elena poured herself a glass of wine, her fingers tracing absent patterns along the rim. She glanced at me, amusement flickering in her expression. "Do you regret it?" I didn't hesitate. "No." Her smile widened. "Good," she murmured. And for the first time in my life, I felt something I had never truly experienced before. Peace. A word I had never truly understood until now. For years, my life had been a relentless cycle of conflict, a tug-of-war where I was always on the losing end. No matter how far I ran, how much I built for myself, Rachel had always been there, tearing it down piece by piece. And now? Now she was gone. No more whispered insults disguised as concern. No more sabotage hidden behind false smiles. No more manipulation disguised as sisterly advice. Rachel had been a storm that never stopped, a force that had dictated the course of my life since childhood. But for the first time, the air was still. The world was mine again. I took a slow sip of my drink, watching the sun dip below the horizon from the balcony. Elena sat beside me, her legs curled beneath her, her expression as unreadable as ever. She had always been like this, unshaken, deliberate, always seeing 3 steps ahead. She hadn't just helped me rid myself of Rachel. She had given me the tools to understand what power really meant. "You're quiet," she observed, watching me over the rim of her glass. I let out a slow breath. "I'm just taking it all in." Elena hummed, setting her glass down. And what do you see? I thought about that for a moment. I see a life I never thought I could have, I admitted. I turned to her, searching for the right words. I always thought peace meant avoiding conflict, keeping my head down, letting Rachel win so I wouldn't have to fight. I exhaled sharply, but I was wrong. Elena watched me carefully. And what does peace mean to you now? I met her gaze, and for the first time, I felt the answer settle deep in my bones. Peace isn't the absence of conflict, I said. It's knowing that I'll never have to run from it again. Elena smiled, slow and knowing, like she had been waiting for me to realize that all along. You finally understand, she murmured. I nodded, setting my glass down, feeling lighter than I had in years. The ghosts of my past were gone. My parents would never forgive me for not mourning Rachel. But they had made their choice long ago, choosing to turn a blind eye to everything she had done. I didn't owe them anything anymore. I didn't owe anyone anything. This was my life now, and I was going to live it on my terms. The months that followed were nothing like the life I had once known. Elena and I traveled. We built something for ourselves, away from the suffocating weight of my past. There were no calls in the middle of the night from Rachel, demanding attention, orchestrating new ways to drag me into her misery. There were no unexpected disasters, no last-minute sabotage, no carefully planned chaos, just silence, the kind that didn't feel empty, but full of possibilities. One evening, we were walking along the beach, the tide brushing against our feet, when Elena slipped her hand into mine. She rarely spoke of Rachel after everything had happened. It wasn't her style to dwell on the past. But that night, she squeezed my fingers gently and said, "You're happier now." It wasn't a question. I didn't need to answer. We both knew the truth. I was. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Because no matter what, I knew one thing for certain. I would never be powerless again. And as I stood there, feeling the waves crash around us, I realized something else. Rachel had spent her entire life trying to break me, but in the end, she had only made me stronger.